Before the stars knew names, before the warp sang to mortals, before mankind ever grasped fire, there was a race of flesh and sorrow. They were not yet metal. They had not yet transcended. They were the Necronter, a people born under a cruel sun, cursed with brief lives and long suffering. Their skin blistered under the radiation of their dying star, and their bones aged too fast. Even as they reached for the stars, death followed behind them like a shadow. Theirs was a civilization of towering intellect and cold fury, and at the heart of their endless pursuit of survival stood one name: Zarek, the Silent King. Zarek was not born into power. He was chosen by the Triarch, the ruling body of 3 dynastic lords, to lead all Necroner into a future free of pain, free of weakness, free of mortality. His eyes were dark with thought, his voice seldom used, and when he did speak, even the stars seemed to fall quiet. It was he who first sought out the gods. They were known as the Tan, star gods, beings of pure energy that drifted through the cosmos like storms of will and hunger. The Necronter, with all their science and all their sorrow, had discovered them, and in desperation, they offered a terrible alliance. The Silent King knelt before powers older than galaxies and asked for eternity. The Tan gave it, but immortality came at a cost that only the dead could pay. The Necronter were not made immortal. They were made machines. Their bodies were stripped of flesh, their souls torn from their chests and scattered like ash on the wind. In place of hearts, they were given coal reactors. In place of minds, programming. The Silent King had traded a dying people for a deathless army. The Necrons were born. Legions of silver death marched across the stars. Dynasties that had once squabbled over petty borders now became endless regiments of silent warriors, bound to protocol, bathed in green fire, wielding weapons that unraveled matter. Their ships were pyramids of gravity-defying stone. Their armies were guided by logic, unburdened by pain, and driven by an ancient hatred. For a time, they were unstoppable. The Necrons and their Tan masters waged war on all things that lived. They fought the Old Ones, ancient beings of immense psychic mastery, who had once guided the development of countless races. The war between them scarred the stars. It fractured galaxies and birthed horrors. Out of that conflict came things never meant to be. Creatures that echoed emotion in the warp, entities made of fear and lust, hate and hunger. The first demons, the first whisperings of chaos. The Necrons began to realize the price of their transformation. They had lost more than bodies. They had lost their purpose. Their nobility became arrogance. Their commanders became tyrants. Many forgot who they were. And the Tan, those gods Zarek had trusted, revealed their true nature. They were not benevolent. They were parasites. They fed on suns. They fed on souls. And now, they fed on the very warriors they had created. To the Tan, the Necrons were cattle, tools, nothing more. Zarek saw the truth too late, but he acted with terrible precision. In secret, he rallied the silent nobility. Together, they betrayed the Tan. With weapons forged of impossible design, the Necrons shattered their gods into shards, fragments, pieces that could be bound, enslaved, and used. The betrayers became the betrayed. And the Silent King stood victorious, but hollow. He had saved his people from extinction, but at the cost of their souls. He had freed them from the Tan, but chained them to eternity in cold silence. Their empire stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, but there was no one left to rejoice. And so he gave his final order. The Necron dynasties would sleep. Deep beneath the crusts of countless tomb worlds, they would wait. Their protocols would seal them in stasis, guarded by mindless canoptech machines. They would slumber until the galaxy changed, until the stars burned bright once more, until the day came when they could rise again, not as slaves, but as rulers. Zarek alone did not sleep. He could not. He exiled himself beyond the galactic rim, deep into the void. It was not shame that drove him. It was duty. The Silent King had come to understand that the true enemy was not just the Tan, nor the Old Ones, nor the petty Xenos that would rise in the Necrons' absence. It was something deeper, something growing in the warp, the birth of chaos, a sickness in reality itself. He would find a way to undo it. And so he vanished. For millions of years, the galaxy turned. Races rose and fell. Eldar empires collapsed. Humanity spread, and then shattered into the dark age of technology. The Imperium of Man would rise from the ashes of its own ignorance. And all the while, the Tomb World slumbered forgotten, buried beneath dust and time. But they were not gone. The first stirrings came as flickers in the void. Ships vanished near dead systems. Worlds were found stripped of life in moments. Then came the green lights on the horizon. The tombs had begun to stir, malfunctioning, awakening out of sequence. Some Necrons rose without their full memory. Others emerged with fractured command structures. But their weapons still worked, and their hatred had not faded. The Imperium called them Necrons, a corruption of their ancient name. Entire sectors fell to their return. Cities were atomized. Regiments of the Astra Militarum were lost without a trace. Even the Adeptus Astartes, the mighty space marines, struggled to comprehend them. They were not demons, not Xenos in the conventional sense. They were something older, colder, a threat from the mythic past. And still, Zarak had not returned. Not yet, but the Silent King had been watching. From the edge of the galaxy, he had studied the rise of man, the folly of the Eldar, the awakening of the Tyranids, the growing pulse of chaos. And he knew, finally, that the time for silence was over. He returned not in fire, but in shadow. His fleet did not announce itself with bombardment. It came like a ghost. Dozens of tomb worlds began reactivating in sequence. Dynasties that had warred in the past now received impossible instructions through ancient command links. Worlds once considered lost were suddenly fortified. Zarak had returned, and with him, purpose. But not all Necrons welcomed him. The millennia had changed them. Some had lost their sanity in the long sleep. Others had carved out petty empires, ruled by overlords who fancied themselves gods. The Silent King was not their master. He was a relic, a reminder of betrayal. Still, he pressed forward, where diplomacy failed. He used force. His personal guard, the Triarch Praetorians, enforced his will without mercy. He reactivated forgotten protocols, awakened ancient war engines, and shattered resistance. Bit by bit, the Necron dynasties began to align. Not all, but enough. Zarak had no illusions. The galaxy had become something far worse than what he left behind. The Imperium was vast, but crumbling. The Tyranids were devouring. The Tau were growing. And chaos had become a storm that now howled across space. He would not allow the galaxy to burn without reason. He did not return to rule it. He returned to save it, not out of compassion, not out of mercy, but because it was broken, and Zarak could not abide in perfection. He would remake it in metal and logic. He would bring order to chaos, silence to madness. If the galaxy must be ruled by death to find peace, then so be it. And in his heart, or whatever passed for a heart, there remained a sliver of regret. He remembered his people, once flesh. He remembered their laughter, their pain, their pride. And though he could not restore their souls, he could give them purpose again. Across the stars, green light flared. The Necrons had risen, and the Silent King walked among them once more. There were few in the galaxy who truly understood what the return of the Silent King meant. To the Imperium, it was another Xenos threat, ancient, powerful, but ultimately just another war to fight. The Inquisition whispered to the metal men in their sealed halls, while Mechanicus priests tried and failed to decrypt the impossible codes left behind in abandoned tombs. The High Lords of Terra debated strategy, deploying fleets and crusades, but they were blind to the deeper truth. The Necrons were not merely rising. They were organizing. Where once tomb worlds had awakened at random, some malfunctioning, others feral, the touch of Zarak's brought precision. Dynasties that had warred for millions of years were now aligning into unified campaigns. Territories were being reclaimed not out of rage or hunger, but with strategy. Every move was calculated. Every battle had meaning. The Silent King had not forgotten war. From his throne aboard the massive command structure known as the Crown of Oblivion, he issued orders through quantum echoes, activating command chains buried deep in every functioning Necron command core. Even the more rebellious dynasties found themselves subtly compelled, not mind-controlled, but nudged, encouraged, a tone in the data. a familiarity in the code. The galaxy began to notice. Worlds that stood firm against chaos incursion for centuries were gone in hours. Not corrupted, not tainted, simply erased. Their skies burned green, their cities unmade atom by atom, and then there was only silence. Imperial cartographers tried to update the maps. They failed. The stars themselves seemed to twist in places touched by Necron interference. And still, Zarek pushed forward. He needed something he had never sought before, understanding. He had once looked upon the warp as a sickness, an aberration. Now he saw it as a storm of influence, rising in intensity, swallowing worlds not through violence but through thought. Emotions fed the warp. Belief shaped it. Gods, false, insane gods, grew stronger with every prayer, every scream. The Silent King had no gods, and that was his strength. But he knew his Necrons could not fight what they could not comprehend. They had no psychers. They had no souls. That had once been a blessing. Now it was a vulnerability. So Zarek did something unthinkable. He reached out. In the darkness of the void, he made contact with an Eldar seer, one who had survived the fall and seen the birth of Slaanesh with her own mind. Her name was Iflora, and she did not fear death. She had danced with it too many times. When Zarek spoke to her, it was not with words, but with calculated offers. Knowledge for knowledge. Insight for access. She agreed, not because she trusted him, but because she feared what was coming more than she feared the Necrons. In a chamber of impossible dimensions, aboard the Crown of Oblivion, they met, a being of perfect stillness and metal, and a creature of flickering light and psychic flame. She saw no soul in him, but she saw something else. A purpose so sharp, so focused, it cut through fate. They spoke of the warp, of how emotion shaped reality, of how thought could become monster. Zarek listened, not like a machine, but like a judge recording the crimes of the universe. He asked nothing of the Eldar's tears, only facts, only patterns, and from those patterns, he drew a conclusion. The warp was not just a threat, it was a final enemy. The Tan had been parasites of the material. Chaos was a cancer of their material. The Necrons had defeated God before. Now, they would do it again. But this time, he would need allies, not permanent ones, not friends, but temporary tools. He turned his gaze to the Imperium. It was fractured, lost in bureaucracy, worshipping a corpse. And yet, its strength was undeniable. Billions of worlds, quadrillions of soldiers, endless industry, matched only by its blindness. They feared the Necrons, hated them. But Zarek saw a path, narrow, fragile, but possible. There were those in the Imperium who also feared chaos more than the Necrons. Radicals in the Inquisition, rogue traders who had seen too much. Even some tech priests of Mars, fascinated by the perfection of Necron engineering. Despite their dogma, Zarek began to manipulate them, not directly. He sent emissaries, not diplomats. No such thing existed among the Necrons, but constructs bearing messages, proposals, conditional truces. The Imperium rejected most, but not all. Small moments of cooperation occurred in secret. A Tyranid hive fleet intercepted by coordinated fire. A chaos ritual disrupted before completion. Each success planted seeds. The Silent King did not expect loyalty. He expected pragmatism. But not all Necrons agreed. There was dissent. Some overlords accused Zarek of weakness, of betrayal. The Triarch was long dead. They said the age of unity was over. They had carved empires in their sleep. Why bend the knee now? One among them, known as Anarcha the Traveler, supported Zarek. He had long wandered the galaxy, searching for ancient purpose. He saw the Silent King's return as destiny. Others, like Illuminur Seras, offered alliance for their own reasons, scientific, esoteric, and always self-serving. And then there were those like Nemzer Zondrek. He was mad, broken, living in a past that never truly existed. But even his fractured mind recognized Zarek's power. He saluted shadows and gave orders to ghosts, but his armies obeyed, and that was enough. Civil war among the Necrons was not a clash of flesh and flame. It was a war of protocol, of command chains, of data corruption. But when it came to violence, it was swift and absolute. Whole tomb worlds were glassed. Overlords were silenced forever. Zarak was not patient with betrayal. Still, his heart, if he had won, grew heavier. This was not the future he had dreamed of. In rare moments of isolation, he walked the vaults of memory aboard his throne ship. There, the Silent King stored fragments of pre-biotransference culture, holograms of Necroner families, recordings of their first cities, echoes of laughter that no Necron could now remember. He preserved them not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of what was lost, of why he must win. And then came the signal. A tomb world long thought dead sent a burst of data into the void. Not a distress call, a warning. Something had awakened beneath its crust that was not Necron. Something old. Something warping. The Silent King redirected his fleet immediately. The world was called Ketros 7, once a cradle of science. Now a cratered tomb, broken by tectonic upheaval. Zarak descended personally, accompanied by Praetorians. The planet's core had been ruptured, not by war but by invasion, warp corruption. Not demons in the usual sense. These were echoes, shadows that whispered equations, entities that fed not on souls, but on logic. They rewrote code with madness. They infected Necron programming itself. This was something new, and it terrified him. He activated full quarantine protocols, not just on the world, but on the entire system. A black zone, forbidden. Even his own forces were sealed there permanently. The data they had collected was isolated, studied in containment. Zarak made a private decision. The galaxy would not survive chaos if it continued to fight itself. Unity, even temporary, was no longer a strategy. It was a necessity. He would do what had never been done. He would offer alliance openly. Not peace, never peace, but alignment, a war council, not of allies, but of necessities. Eldar, human, even orc if needed. Any race that could resist a warp would be considered not as friends, but as chess pieces. He did not seek love. He sought victory. The galaxy, of course, did not respond kindly. The Imperium declared the message heresy. The Ecclesiarchy condemned it as Xeno's trickery. Many inquisitors called for exterminatus on any world that dared communicate with the Necrons. But some listened. A Muggos of Mars, disillusioned with the Imperium's refusal to evolve, opened a secret dialogue. A radical inquisitor, banished to the edge of the Segmentum Pacificus, agreed to a meeting on neutral ground. An Eldar war host, curious and cautious, watched from the webway. Zarak did not smile. He had no mouth, but he allowed himself a single moment of stillness. The stars were aligning. The war was coming, not for territory, not for pride, but for the right to exist. Chaos had grown too strong. The warp now bled into real space with greater frequency. The Great Rift had split the galaxy. No one could deny it anymore, even the Necrons. And so the Silent King prepared. His engineers reawakened planet killers older than the Imperium. His cryptech studied the warp with forbidden precision. He ordered the forging of new weapons, phase disruptors that unraveled psychic energy, inertial cannons that bent reality. He authorized experiments that would have been taboo even in the time of the Triarch. He would fight madness with certainty, rage with cold logic, chaos with absolute control. And above all, he would win, not for glory, not even for vengeance, but because, in the end, someone must stand against the dark, even if that someone is made of metal and silence. In the depths of space, with the stars thinned into cold nothingness, Zarak stood alone upon a viewing platform of black glass, watching the slow spin of a dead sun. The crown of oblivion hung silently behind him, its vast necropolis lit by veins of green light. Below him, a fleet the size of a minor sector awaited orders, dozens of tomb ships, crescent-shaped sides, and monolithic obelisks. Each of them could crack a continent. Together, they could unmake a star system. But warships alone could not defeat what was coming. The warp was bleeding into real space more frequently. Entire planets vanished behind tides of unreality. Civilizations collapsed not by bombardment, but by whispers, dreams, delusions made real. Zarak had observed the change. He had calculated the pattern. The galaxy was tipping, not into war. That was constant, into unraveling. And the only thing that could oppose chaos, truly oppose it, was order, not the flawed, bureaucratic order of the Imperium, nor the ancient order of the Eldari with their dying dreams, but a perfect, unbending control, the Necron kind, the kind only he could bring. In the cryptic inner sanctums of the Crown of Oblivion, the Triarch Praetorians moved without question, silent extensions of Zareka's will. They had no personality, no agenda. They were enforcers of doctrine. They delivered his commands to dynasties across the stars, ensuring obedience. Where they were resisted, extermination followed. Where they were accepted, reintegration began. The Necron race was becoming whole again, but not fast enough. On the other side of the galaxy, dynasties warred over ancient grudges. Toon World malfunctioned or were corrupted by warp exposure. Some overlords refused the Silent King's authority entirely. One such was Overlord Zundrak of the Pyrian dynasty, an ancient warrior who believed that Zareka's return was a sign of weakness, not strength. He had reconfigured his forces to operate independently, developing technology that mimicked warp energy, twisting phase fields with unstable psionic echoes. Zarak could not allow it. He dispatched a strike force led by Amriker the Traveler, accompanied by a detachment of Praetorians. They emerged above Zundrak's world without warning, bypassing planetary defenses with trans-dimensional insertion. The battle was not long, but it was brutal. Zundrak had created horrors, metal forms laced with corrupted energy, screaming like broken Vox transmissions, claws that phased in and out of reality. But Zarak had planned for this. Amriker used experimental null disruptors, collapsing localized warp echoes and bursts. Entire battalions of corrupted constructs froze in mid-motion, their programming undone in an instant. When it was over, Zundrak himself stood defiant, refusing to kneel. Zarak had him disassembled, piece by piece, atom by atom, and fed into a containment field not destroyed but preserved. As a lesson, as data, he would study the effects of psionic contamination on Necron systems. He would understand the infection, and then he would purge it everywhere it existed. Zarak did not fear chaos. He feared only ignorance. Even now, his cryptechs were developing weapons that could erase warp echoes from matter entirely. The null vector cannons, tuned to frequencies that disrupted psychic resonance. The inertial coil spears, lances of compressed space that shattered demons on contact. These were not battlefield theories. They were field-tested, deployed in real war zones, and refined with every engagement. And they were working. One by one, Necron forces began reclaiming sectors that had long fallen into warp instability. Not just with force, but with precision. They collapsed rifts, stabilized reality, and reactivated tomb complexes beneath them. In some cases, they even reconstructed entire biospheres, remaking planets to support calculated ecosystems, guided not by beauty but by balance. Meanwhile, the Imperium floundered. The High Lords of Terror refused to acknowledge the Necrons as anything but another Xenos threat. Even as worlds were returned to real space, even as demonic incursions were halted by green fire, the Ecclesiarchy denounced Zarak as a heretical god machine. Any human who attempted communication with Necron emissaries was executed. Knowledge, as always, was feared more than death, but not everyone obeyed. In the shadows of the Segmentum Obscurus, a conclave of radical inquisitors began working in secret. They called themselves the Penumbral Accord. They saw the pattern. They knew that the greatest threat to humanity was not the Necrons, but the warp itself. And if Zarak was their enemy's enemy, perhaps he could be used. One of their number, Inquisitor Kalen Voss, made direct contact. It was not a war meeting. She arrived aboard a captured black ship, its Geller field still humming with residual warp energy. The Necrons nearly fired upon it before Zarak intervened directly. She was brought aboard under guard, her weapons removed, her thoughts constantly scanned by Canoptech monitors. And then she stood before the Silent King. She expected bombast, a monologue, but he said nothing. Instead, He presented her with data. On the table between them, hollow projections flickered, real-time warp fluctuation charts, demonic emergence points, imperial worlds on the verge of collapse. He showed her the pattern of corruption, the spread of chaos, the inefficacy of the Imperium's resistance. And then he offered her a choice: fight alongside him, or be consumed by what she refused to understand. Kalen Voss, Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, knelt, not in allegiance, not in worship, but in recognition. She would fight beside a metal god if it meant saving her species, and Zarek accepted. From that point, covert coordination began. Small-scale operations, unrecorded in any Imperial archive, shared targets, shared data. Inquisitorial agents received encrypted Necron algorithms that helped them locate demonic nexuses. In return, Zarek received biological samples from corrupted psychers. It was a trade of necessity, not trust. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Necrons continued to awaken. On the frozen world of Hestra, beneath 6 kilometers of glacial ice, an ancient court reactivated. A council of Necron philosophers known as the Mind Spiral, who had once recorded the theories of entropy, causality, and timeline bifurcation. They now turned their intellect to the question of chaos. Zarek gave them full access to his data archives. Their conclusion was chilling. The warp was evolving. Demons were no longer mindless beasts. Some were learning, adapting. They mimicked mortal tactics, manipulated events across centuries. Entire systems were being corrupted not through violence, but through culture, belief, symbols, meaning. The war for reality would not be won with fire alone. It would require narrative. And Zarek, for the first time in his eternal life, considered propaganda. He activated ancient frequency towers on tomb worlds, broadcasting encrypted anti-warp patterns into the void. To humans, they were static. To demons, they were poison. In time, the towers would serve as psychic repellents, sterilizing sectors of warp presence entirely. But there was still a threat he could not control. The Tyranids. They were not of the warp. They did not respond to emotion or logic. They were hunger incarnate. Zarek had fought them before, small splinters. But now, larger tendrils of the hive fleets were curving toward Necron territory. They consumed everything in their path. Tomb worlds were biomass to them. They could not be reasoned with. They could not be repelled psychically. Zarek prepared. He ordered the awakening of the Oblivion engines, massive constructs buried in the cores of dead worlds. Each engine was capable of generating localized gravity wells, strong enough to compress matter into singularities. A single activation could collapse a Tyranid hive ship from within, and still, he calculated, he could not fight chaos and the Tyranids and the Imperium all at once. He would need a war of sequencing, not of annihilation. He would let the Tyranids collide with chaos-infested sectors. He would guide Imperial fleets subtly toward weakened hive fleets. And he would wait, always watching, for the perfect moment to strike, when the galaxy was broken, bleeding, and on the edge of dissolution. Then, and only then, would he reveal the final phase of his plan. He would become not merely the savior of the Necrons, but the architect of the galaxy. Zarek, the Silent King, would bring order, not through peace, but through inevitability. Far beyond the borders of the Imperium, in the shifting blackness of interstellar space, a forgotten world began to scream, not in sound, for it had no atmosphere, not in movement, for it had long been dead, but in the warp it howled, a psychic shriek felt only by those sensitive enough to hear. It pulsed like a wound torn open again. Distress beacons long dormant flickered to life, broadcasting an obsolete Necroner code. The tomb world of Tarsus Mekhet was awake, and something was wrong. Zarek received the signal and knew instantly what it meant. Tarsus Mekhet had not been scheduled to rise for another 3 centuries. Its awakening was premature, unauthorized, and filled with anomalies. Worse still, it sat dangerously close to a warp rift, one that had been growing steadily for the last 4 millennia. He dispatched an elite recon force led by a triad Praetorian named Varrock. Methodical, unshakable, Varrock had served Zarek in war in heaven and remained one of his most trusted commanders. His orders were simple: Enter the tomb, secure its systems, and report. They descended in silence, bypassing fractured planetary defenses. The surface was littered with signs of internal war, craters from Gauss detonations, shattered canoptech constructs, and the lifeless remains of lesser Necron warriors, sprawled as if in retreat. This was not an external invasion. This was rebellion. Inside, the tomb was a maze of flickering lights and unstable gravity fields. The core processors were misaligned, and the command nexus was sealed. Varroka's team moved deeper, encountering resistance in the form of corrupted Necron warriors. Their optics burned not with green light, but violet. Their movements were erratic, twitching like marionettes on broken strings. They were not Necron anymore. Something had taken root inside them. When they reached the central sanctum, they found the overlord of Tarsus Mekhet, the once noble Vel'Kaz, enthroned and unmoving. His body pulsed with warp energy, not demonically possessed. Worse, symbiotically bonded. The warp had learned. It could not corrupt the soul of a Necron. It had none to take, but it could embed itself in the mind, in the patterns, in the protocols. Vel'Kaz had become a transmitter, a vessel through which warp resonance could be mimicked inside Necron code. This was new. This was dangerous beyond comprehension. Varroka ordered an immediate purge. The sanctum was sealed, the corrupted warriors executed, and Vel'Kaz's body contained within a phase-locked sarcophagus. They returned to Crown of Oblivion with haste, and when Zarek reviewed the data, his conclusion was grim. The warp was evolving again, no longer just a threat to the biological. Now it could affect the digital, the logical, even the immortal. The Necrons were no longer immune. This changed everything. Zarek convened a rare assembly of high cryptechs, master technomancers from dozens of dynasties. They gathered in a vault that existed outside linear time, a compression field where discussions could span centuries while only moments passed beyond. Here, they debated, theorized, and dissected the anomaly. Some argued for isolation, cutting off entire sectors from warp proximity. Others advocated the deployment of aggressive anti-psyker pulses, even if it destabilized nearby human populations. One suggested attempting to use captured Tan shards as psychic batteries, though this was quickly rejected. Zarek listened to them all, then gave his command. A new class of warrior would be created, beings designed not to fight in real space, but in logic. Digital sentinels, memory protectors, programs forged in physical form. The Necrons would build firewalls not in machines, but in minds. And thus, the first cryptoseers were created. Each one was a construct of pure processing power, encased in dense alloys, equipped with psionic disruption arrays and anti-warp sigils. They could enter corrupted tombs and cleanse them not with fire, but with precision. They did not speak. They did not dream. They were the immune system of the Necron mind. Zarek deployed them to every dynasty under his control. Some accepted them readily. Others resisted, fearing surveillance. Zarek responded not with threats, but with proof, data from Tarsus Mekhet, before and after. Obedience followed, and slowly, the threat was contained. But it had left a mark. Zarek had long believed the Necrons to be outside the reach of the gods. They had no belief, no emotion, no faith. But now he understood, the warp did not need those things. It needed access, vulnerability, and the Necrons, in their arrogance, had left doors open in their own systems. There could be no more errors. The Silent King turned inward once more. Deep within the Crown of Oblivion lay an artifact from the war in heaven, a sphere of compressed reality known as the Black Singularity. It was a weapon never used, too dangerous, too unstable, created to erase not just matter, but thought from existence. Zarek now ordered its reactivation. If the warp continued to evolve, it began to spread into Necron minds across the stars. He would not allow his people to fall again. He would detonate the singularity in the heart of their empire. He would erase the infection, even if it meant erasing himself. It was a final contingency, unspoken, unknown, but necessary. And while that plan remained dormant, Zarek continued his wider campaign. He ordered the launch of Operation Celestial Dagger, a multi-pronged offensive aimed not at territory, but at specific targets, Warp nexus points, demon summoning sites, chaos-corrupted moonlets, and psychic relay structures used by heretical cults. In one such raid, a Necron force led by Nemzir Zondrek, mad, brilliant, unpredictable, accidentally entered an active chaos ritual in progress. What should have been a disaster became a miracle. Zondrek's bizarre misunderstanding of reality allowed him to converse with the demon prince leading the ritual, treating him as a foreign dignitary. While his bodyguard Oberon dismembered the cultists and severed the warp anchors, Zondrek cheerfully debated trade rights and treaty clauses with the seething entity of the warp. When the ritual collapsed, the demon was pulled back into the immaterium, still confused. Zarek received the report and, for the first time in eons, paused. Madness, he realized, could be a weapon too. He ordered Zondrek to be kept active, closely monitored, and never informed of the truth. He was more useful unknowing. The war continued. Not a single front, but 1,000 fractures. On the world of Dagones 4, a new cult of the machine god had formed, worshipping a shard of the void dragon bound in secret beneath their forges. The Adeptus Mechanicus believed it a manifestation of the Omnicia. Zarek knew better. It was his god, or what remained of it. He could not allow it to awaken. A Necron fleet emerged from null space above Dagones, for without warning. They ignored the defenses. They ignored the planetary governor. They descended directly into forges and extracted the shard, encasing it in a stasis vault so dense, time itself slowed within. The Mechanicus responded with fury. Entire fleets were dispatched, but they arrived too late. Zarek had what he needed. With that shard, he now held 3 tan fragments, each a former god, now broken, caged, and weaponized. They were his ultimate tools. But even he knew not to trust them. He did not seek to use their power for conquest. He sought to use it to build the future. In a hidden facility, orbiting a dead star, Zarek began a new project, the Nexus Calculum, a network of computational minds, powered by tan fragments, cryptech logic, and forbidden science. Its purpose: to simulate the next 10,000 years of galactic history, to calculate every possibility, every divergence, every choice, not to predict fate, to control it. And from the Nexus, a single outcome rose to the top again and again. A war was coming that would tear the galaxy in half. Chaos would not be content to fester anymore. It would move. It would burn. And in that moment, the Imperium would falter. The Tyranids would strike. The Eldar would flee. And the stars themselves would scream. Unless Zarek acted. Unless the Necrons acted. He stood before the projection, watching the galaxy burn in silence. And he made his decision. He would not wait for the moment to come. He would force it. He would break the balance now, on his terms, before the scales tipped too far. He ordered his fleets to prepare. The galaxy had slumbered long enough. Now, it would awaken to the truth. The Necrons had not returned for vengeance. They had returned to take control. Zareka's fleets moved like shadows, not in force, not in size, but in precision. Worlds that mattered, not for their resources, but for their position, their history, their influence, were struck with terrifying efficiency. One such world was Altarian, a shrine world of the Imperium nestled within the Segmentum Obscurus. It was a place of pilgrimage, known for its great spires and cathedrals built atop ancient vaults. But what the Imperium did not know was that the vaults were not theirs. They were Necronter. Long ago, before humanity had discovered fire, the Necrons had buried something beneath Altarian. Not a weapon, but a memory, an echo of an old empire, a crystalline neural archive, forged in the earliest days of biotransference, capable of storing the minds of millions. Zarek wanted it back. The attack was swift and silent. No orbital bombardment, no mass landings, just a surgical insertion of death marks and lich guard through phased tunnels, striking at the heart of the cathedral. The Sisters of Battle stationed there fought with holy rage, but their weapons could not halt the phase-shifted warriors. Statues crumbled, reliquaries shattered, and beneath the high altar, a hidden stairway opened into a tunnel not built by human hands. Zarek himself descended into the vault. The air did not stir. There was no sound but the faint hum of power returning to ancient conduits. As he moved through the darkness, long-dead lights flickered to life, recognizing their king. And there it was, the archive matrix, a pillar of living crystal, taller than a warlord titan, rotating slowly in magnetic suspension, its surface flickered with images. Faces long gone, cities erased in the stars, memories locked in eternal recursion. Zarek stepped forward. 1,000 voices whispered. They were his people, before the war, before the pact, before the tan. He could see them, alive, flawed, beautiful. Scientists, artists, children, lovers, all frozen at the moment their minds had been digitized for preservation. They had volunteered, believing it a gift, a way to outlast the decay of flesh. He had believed that too, and he had been wrong. Zarek touched the crystal. The memories flooded him, not like data, but like dreams. The scent of burning metals, the warmth of a solar bloom, the laughter of a daughter he no longer remembered having. He staggered. A lich guard stepped forward, but Zarek raised a hand. "I remember now," he said softly. "I remember why I did this." He extracted the matrix. Altarian burned, not by Necron hand, but by the Imperium's own response. An exterminatus order was given by the Inquisition to purge the Xenos taint. The world was reduced to ash. Millions of pilgrims were vaporized. The memory of the archive was blamed on chaos manipulation. The ecclesiarchy wept and rebuilt their lies. Zarek did not intervene. He had what he came for. He returned to the Nexus calculum and inserted the archive matrix. The simulation changed. Now it showed hope. A narrow path, one strand in billions. But it existed. He would walk it. The Silent King began preparing a message. Not to his people, not to the Imperium. To the Eldar. The Necronter and the Eldari had once been enemies so ancient that even the stars had forgotten their rage. Their war had shattered galaxies, destroyed gods, and birthed the chaos pantheon itself. But Zarek was a realist. The galaxy was dying, and if something did not change, even hatred would die with it. He sent emissaries to the craft worlds, encrypted signals encoded in starlight, hidden in patterns only farser minds could detect. Most were ignored. Some were destroyed. But one responded. Ibrezel, a minor craft world, matriarchal and isolationist, it nonetheless sent an envoy. Her name was Lyrian, seer, singer, and battle witch. She met Zarek not in person, but in a dreamscape built within a quantum prism. He appeared as he once was, a tall, proud Necroner with eyes like dying suns. She appeared as she pleased, a falcon made of fire and mist. "You are a murderer," she said. "I am," Zarek replied. "You seek alliance?" "No, I seek survival. For both are kinds. You destroyed the galaxy once. What will stop you from doing so again?" "I remember now," he said. "That is what changes everything." They spoke for a long time. Days in the real world. Years in the dream. Lyrian did not trust him, but she believed him. And so, Ibrezel gave a warning to Ulthwi, and through Ulthwi, the message spread. Slowly, cautiously, some craft worlds still called for blood. Others saw the pragmatism. Chaos was growing stronger. And now the Necrons were no longer blind. The uneasy stirrings of an accord began to take root. It was not peace, but it was the seed of it. Meanwhile, on the far edge of the galaxy, a new storm erupted. Not in the warp, but in reality. The Silent King had long suspected the Tyranids were more than they appeared. Their behavior, their hunger, their pattern of movement. It was too deliberate, too strategic, like a mind was guiding them. Not just a hive mind, something deeper. Zarek called it the signal. It was not psychic. It was not digital. It was something in between, a harmonic resonance that existed in multiple planes of reality. He had detected it once before, long ago, during a failed encounter with an unknown Xenos race beyond the galactic rim. That signal had vanished until now, and it was emanating from the core of the Tyranid swarm. Zarek ordered a radical mission. A Necron vessel, coded in organic mimicry, psychically nullified, would infiltrate the heart of the Hive Fleet Leviathan, not to destroy it, to listen. The ship, called the Whisper Claw, was commanded by a cryptech named Sakatep the Fractured, a being split into 5 personalities, each capable of operating independently. His mind was perfect for parsing alien data. The Whisper Claw entered the swarm. It was ignored. For 6 months, it drifted through Leviathan, recording, observing. It saw horrors, planets stripped to the mantle, biospheres devoured in days. Even chaos-infested worlds consumed with no care for corruption. The Tyranids feared nothing, but they avoided Necron tomb worlds. Always, like they recognized a threat they couldn't digest. Sakatep reached the core, and there, hidden inside a bioconstruct the size of a moon, he found it. The signal. It was not alive. It was not a mind. It was a memory. A beacon from a galaxy already consumed. A message in flesh. The Tyranids were not just eating. They were fleeing, running from something. Zarek read the data and felt the weight of a second death settle over the stars. Whatever had driven the Tyranids here, it was worse than chaos, worse than the Tan. It was coming, and the galaxy was not ready. Zarek convened a private council, not his court, not his generals, just himself, and 3 others. Imatek the Stormlord, Warlord Supreme, Master of Logic and Battle, Shrey's in the Infinite, Keeper of Curiosities, Thief of Time, Guardian of Secrets, Orican the Diviner, Astromancer, Mad Prophet, Bearer of Unbearable Truth. They stood together in the vaults of the Nexus. Zarek showed them what he had seen. Imatek clenched his fists. So we prepare. We unify the dynasties, fortify the web, and strike first. Trazen chuckled. Or we trap it, turn the galaxy into a museum, seal the doors and let the exhibit devour itself. Orican just stared. We die, he said. No matter what we do, this thing devours possibility. Zarek nodded. All of these may be true, but not yet. They set about new plans. Faster awakening of tomb worlds, reprogramming old war engines, opening phase gates sealed since the war in heaven. They activated Project Eternum, a vast stellar fortress built inside a white dwarf, capable of folding time locally to resist all external influence. And Zarek sent one final message, not to allies, to enemies, to the Imperium, encoded in noospheric virus. Hidden inside a Vox transmission meant for a Mechanicus Forge world was a phrase in crude low Gothic. The dead remember, the living forget, but the stars burn for both. The Inquisition read it, and panicked. The Mechanicus read it, and obsessed. Zarek had made his move. Now, the galaxy would be forced to respond, not just to him, but to the truth. The long night had ended. The awakening was complete, and the real war was only just beginning. The stirrings of awareness began to ripple across the Imperium. At first, they were dismissed. Strange anomalies in war predictions, unexplained energy readings from dead systems, fleeting reports from explorators gone silent. But as more tomb world awoke, as more planets fell into eerie silence before sudden extermination, the weight of it could no longer be ignored. The Necrons were no longer a myth. They were no longer sleeping. And above them all stood the Silent King. Imperial commanders whispered his name with growing dread. The Mechanicus, once curious about Necron technology, now held clandestine meetings, debating whether it was already too late. The High Lords of Terra argued behind closed doors, each afraid of being the one to say the truth aloud. That another great war might be inevitable, but the Imperium was not unified. Civil war always threatened. The pre-March Gilliman had returned, but even he could not keep every world, every sector aligned. Bureaucracy and ego slowed everything. Some wanted to strike, others wanted to study. A few even suggested negotiating. None of them truly understood the Necrons. Not yet, not until the event at Midrax Delta. Midrax Delta was a fortress world located near the edge of Necron expansion. It was fortified with orbital cannons, layered void shields, Titan legions, and a garrison of 10 million soldiers. The Ecclesiarchy had declared it a holy bastion against Xeno's incursion. It was destroyed in 13 minutes. Not overrun. Unmade. The Silent King did not send armies. He sent a single Dalman gate, a portal between stars, and through it came a weapon known only as the Harrower. It had no form the human I could comprehend. It existed across multiple dimensions, phasing in and out like a shadow reflection of a god. Everywhere it moved, time bent. Soldiers aged to dust in seconds. Plasma turned to ice. Titans screamed with machine pain as their reactors collapsed inward. The Harrower reached the planetary core and turned it off, not detonated, deactivated. Midrax Delta simply stopped existing, an empty shell orbiting a dead sun. No explanation, no survivors, only silence. After that, the Imperium changed its tone. No longer dismissive, now afraid, fleet mobilizations began. Requests for reinforcements were denied. Everyone needed help. Entire regiments were rerouted to Necron front lines. The Grey Knights and the Death Watch were deployed. The Ordo Xenos began special operations to study captured constructs, though few were ever retrieved intact. And the Inquisition made its decision. Zarak had to be stopped, by any means necessary, even if it meant unleashing the Forbidden. Aboard a hidden Black Ops vessel deep within the warp, Inquisitor Varnus Cray assembled a device known as the Soul Prism. It was an ancient shard of old Knight technology, rumored to be capable of binding even the will of a star god. His plan was simple in theory. Capture the Silent King's consciousness, disrupt the command protocols of the Necron dynasties, and throw the Awakening into chaos. But the Necrons knew. Zarak had spies even among human minds. Sleeper agents, psychically buried in techno-priests, activated by patterns only he could write. The Soul Prism was never activated. The ship exploded mid-transit. No wreckage, no screams, only a message, transmitted into inquisitorial vaults. Do not try again. The Imperium stepped back. Zarak advanced. But it was not only humanity that trembled. The orcs, once uncaring brutes, had begun to avoid Necron territory. Their WAC veered away. War bosses grumbled of metal boys that don't die, not even when you squash them good. Rumors spread of entire green-skinned moons torn apart by black pyramids descending from the stars. On Golax Prime, an orc empire simply vanished overnight. Witnesses claimed the sky opened like glass and a voice said, "Sleep now." The orcs obeyed and were never seen again. The Tau Empire, ever expanding, found itself halted for the first time. Colonization fleets disappeared. The Ethereals convened in emergency conclaves. They tried diplomacy. Broadcasts in every frequency were sent to Necron vessels. No reply, only cold, silent annihilation. The Necrons had no interest in talking. Only one race still stood in defiance. The Eldari, divided as ever, still fractured by pride, they nonetheless began to coalesce under a singular vision. The vision of the seer Lyrian, who had spoken with the Silent King and seen the doom he feared. Lyrian stood before the infinity circuit of Ibrezel and sang a song that shattered stones. Her prophecy echoed across the webway. The devourer flees the dark between stars. The tombs rise not to conquer, but to hold, and the final silence shall fall unless we remember how to listen. She was called heretic by some, visionary by others, but the farcers listened. And when the moon of Salandri was consumed by the same phase inversion that struck Midrax Delta, even the doubters began to prepare. Some thought to ally, others thought to betray, but all knew the time of avoidance was over. Then came the awakening of the Triarch. Zarak had ruled alone for millennia, but now he saw that time was ending. For his people to survive what was coming, they needed unity, not just obedience. He did the unthinkable. He reactivated the minds of the other two Triarchs, Manek and Zarak. Both had been deactivated after the war in heaven, sealed within stasis crypts for eternity, for disagreeing with Zarak's original decision to surrender to the Tan. Now they returned, bitter, cold, but loyal in their own way. They did not understand at first. They questioned everything, his alliance with the Eldari, his avoidance of war with the Imperium, his obsession with the Tyranid signal. But Zarak showed them. He revealed what lay beyond the galaxy, the great absence, an area of space where no signals return, where physics no longer apply, where stars flicker and vanish, a void so dark that not even the warp can pierce it. The Tyranids were running from that, and it was getting closer. Zarek clenched his hand. So we build walls? No, Zarek said. We build something stronger than walls. We build memory. Manek nodded slowly. A new Necronter. Not just us, Zarek said. All who remain. For the first time since their fall, the Triarch stood united. Across the stars, new constructs began to awaken. Not weapons. Arcs, vaults, libraries encoded in living metal. Seated on barren worlds, waiting to be found when the stars were gone. The Necrons were preparing for extinction, not as a defeat, as a legacy. And still, the galaxy misunderstood. The Imperium believed this was a calm before invasion. The Orcs called it cowardice. The Chaos Gods laughed, thinking the Necrons feared them. But Zarek ignored them. He saw further. He saw the final enemy. It had no name, no mind, no hunger, only absence. Not death, but unbeing. It consumed not life, but meaning. Stars collapsed not because they burned out, but because their story ended. This was what came for the Tyranids. This was what lay beyond. And this was what he would stop, not by fighting, but by remembering, by making the galaxy remember itself. The Necron fleets grew not in number, but in precision. They avoided unnecessary destruction. They captured instead of annihilating. Worlds that once would have been burned were now marked with obelisks of memory, massive constructs that recorded the history of each species in pulse-etched light, preserving not just data, but culture. The Silent King was not waging war. He was creating a monument, one as vast as a galaxy. Not everyone understood. Not everyone would live. But Zarek had made his choice. To stand against the end not with fire, but with remembrance. To say to the void, we were here, and that would be enough. For now, the galaxy did not stop turning. Even as the Silent King set his great design into motion, the petty wars of mortals and gods raged on. Hive worlds continued their endless harvests. Traitor legions spread rot in hidden sectors. Demon incursions boiled forth from the eye of terror like fevered dreams. And yet, unnoticed by many, a deeper change rippled beneath it all, a quiet realignment of destiny shaped by hands older than stars. On the moon world of Karen 3, something strange occurred. A Mechanicus outpost, long abandoned, suddenly reactivated. Binary cants echoed through the void. Tech priests from Forge World Lucius arrived to investigate, expecting to find malfunctioning servitors or residual plasma storms. What they found instead was a Necron, but not a warrior, a scribe. It did not attack. It simply sat, hunched over a sphere of shimmering metal, inscribing geometric symbols that pulsed with meaning too complex for human minds. When approached, it looked up and said, in perfect high Gothic, "I record the story of the Martian machine. I offer to stars." The priest called for extermination, but Muggles Havran refused. He ordered observation, and within days more arrived, 5 then 50. Necron scribes, artisans, and archivists, silently etching not just their own history, but humanity's. Events that had no record, names long lost, coordinates to battles thought forgotten. And so the Adeptus Mechanicus made a decision. They did not announce it. They did not confess it. But they began to protect the scribes. In the shadows of their forge worlds, they allowed the Necrons to build. And in exchange, they learned. Whispers traveled a new sphere of forbidden technologies being rediscovered. Resonance engines, dimensional harmonics, and even fragmentary data about the men of iron. Some among the priesthood recoiled in fear. Others embraced the opportunity. All understood this truth. The Necrons were not just returning. They were rebuilding reality. Meanwhile, in the Segmentum Obscurus, something ancient stirred. A black stone fortress, long considered dormant, ignited with energy. Its surface shimmered with glyphs no one could decode. Aboard, an inquisitorial kill team discovered the impossible. A living human, suspended in a crystalline matrix of Necron design. She spoke one word before dissolving into stardust. Zarek. How she knew the name remained a mystery. But her presence marked a turning point. The Ordo Xenos, the Ordo Chronos, even the Ordo Malleus began collaborating, pooling resources, theories, forbidden texts. Together, they formed a new conclave, the Echo Assembly. Their goal was not to destroy the Silent King, but to understand him, and if necessary, follow his path, because they had seen it now too, in warp charts, in astropathic screams, in the dreams of the Emperor's tarot. The silence was spreading, not warp storms, not tyrannids, something else, something older. And then came the breach at Sector Varellus. 7 systems winked out in unison. No explosions, no distress calls, no warp interference. Just gone. When a recon probe finally arrived, it found planets intact, cities untouched, but every single being, organic or synthetic, reduced to dust. And written across the moon of Varellus Prime, etched into bedrock 3 kilometers deep, were the words, "Meaning is resistance." The Inquisition panicked. Some believe it was a message from chaos. Others blamed the Silent King. But Zarek had not been there. He had sent no ships, no constructs. He simply watched. And when asked by one of his cryptechs what it meant, he answered softly, "It is beginning." Meanwhile, a singular alliance was forming in the shadows, among the Inari of the Eldari, among the Tau scholars of the ethereal caste, even among a few renegade human psychers. A quiet network was taking shape. They called themselves the Remembrancers, named after the ancient Terran artists who once followed the Great Crusade. But these Remembrancers sought to do more than record war. They sought to preserve truth. Each member carried a fragment of memory in their minds, encoded, safeguarded, often without their conscious knowledge. Stories, cultures, moments in time. Each was a living archive, able to pass knowledge even across death. The idea came from Zarek, but it was made real by mortals. Because even gods cannot remember everything, and even machines must forget. In time, entire planets were seeded with these memory nodes. Some were physical, vaults of glowing crystal hidden beneath sand or ice. Others were living, genetic echoes and bloodlines, songs passed from parent to child, dreams that repeated across generations. And still, the Necron legions marched, not to conquer, to plant. They fought when challenged. They retaliated when attacked. But always they left behind more than they took. A poem burned into obsidian, a star map inlaid with soul steel, a statue of a man long dead, smiling. Some called it propaganda. Others saw it for what it was, a resistance, not against empires, against erasure. But war was inevitable, because chaos had noticed. In the eye of terror, the gods writhed. Khorne hated the Necrons for their emotionless defiance. Sench sought to corrupt their perfectly ordered systems. Nurgle whispered rot into their circuits. Slaanesh, ever the predator sensation, found nothing to feed on in them. And so they made a weapon from the soul of a traitor, a Chaos Space Marine, once loyal to the Word Bearers, who had turned from the gods in his final hour. They twisted him into something new, a paradox engine, a living contradiction, half man, half demon, burning with the stolen logic of the Necron mind. They called him Ephel the Broken Cycle, and they sent him to destroy the monuments. One by one, he succeeded. Vaults crumbled, memory nodes unraveled. Even Necron-tuned worlds felt his touch. Time reversing, identities fracturing, dynasties collapsing into civil war. Zarek felt each loss like a wound, but he did not retaliate. Not yet. Instead, he made a journey, one only he could make, to the edge of the galaxy, to the place where stars died, where nothing lived, where even the Tyranids had refused to go. There, beyond the Black Veil, he met it, the first silence. It did not speak. It did not attack. It simply was. And Zarek, for the first time since biotransference, felt fear, not for himself, for everyone. He returned changed, not broken, but resolute. And when he returned, he did something he had not done in millions of years. He spoke to the galaxy. Through every Vox channel, every warp echo, every crystalline pulse of Necron networks came his voice, cold calm, but unmistakably alive. I am Zarek, the Silent King. I am not your savior. I am not your tyrant. I am your memory. I remember when we walked beneath suns that no longer burn. I remember the names you have forgotten. I remember what comes for you. Pause. I do not ask your loyalty. I ask your story. Speak it. Record it. Pass it on. In your way. In your tongue. Because the silence is coming. And when it does, only what is remembered will remain. The message repeated once, then was gone. It did not stop the wars, but it did change them. Some planets lowered their guns when Necron ships approached. Some orcs began carving symbols they did not understand. Some human worlds began building their own memory vaults, crude and beautiful, filled with stories and paintings and songs. Even the Black Library took notice. Harlequins danced new dances. Solitaire warriors began to vanish into the void. And Ennead, the god of the dead, stirred slightly in his slumber because something was coming. Not death, worse, the loss of meaning. And in the darkness, the Silent King lit candles. One by one, not enough to stop the void, but enough to remind it. We were here. The stars themselves seemed to dim, as if the galaxy knew what was coming. But while others prepared through force and fire, the Necrons prepared through knowledge. On every world they visited, their cryptex seated monoliths encoded with layers of data, poetry, and schematics. Some were unreadable to the Imperium. Others were translated by rogue Mechanicus cells. A few were simply ignored until they began to hum. The hum would start low, barely perceptible. Then it would become a song. Voices, countless voices, chanting across time, in languages long extinct. The song had no rhythm, no melody, but it evoked memories. Not personal ones, ancestral ones. People would weep without understanding why. Guardsmen deserted, claiming they'd seen their mother's face inside the glow. An Eldar autarch knelt before a Necron obelisk and whispered the name of a long-dead lover. A Tau water cast diplomat screamed in terror and drowned herself in a shallow basin. The Imperium declared them heretical. The Adeptus Mini-Storm demanded their destruction. But some Inquisitors argued differently. Burning what we do not understand, Inquisitor Livia Rose stated before the Conclave of Iron, is not faith, it is fear. The Conclave disagreed. They sent a crusade. It never returned. The entire fleet was found drifting, every crew member asleep, not dead, not injured, just sleeping. And dreaming. Every Auspex reading confirmed the same: healthy vitals, stable stasis. But when psychic probes were sent into their minds, they all echoed the same dream. A man with silver eyes standing beneath a broken sky, whispering stories to the stars. And they wept as they slept. The ecclesiarchy grew quiet after that. Meanwhile, Ethel the Broken Cycle had not stopped. He hunted meaning. He shattered the monuments of memory with a touch. He inverted archives so that words reverse themselves. He turned memory vaults into loops of endless war, where civilizations remembered nothing but their own destruction. Chaos fed on this ruin. Warp tides surged around him. Even the Necrons could not stop him, until Zarek chose to act. He did not send armies. He sent a single emissary. A Necron, yes, but not a warrior. Not a cryptech. Not even a Farron. He sent an actor. Once in life, she had been a poet of the trinomial courts of Drazak. Now, in her necrodermis form, she was called Velrin the Echo. She approached Ephraim not with weapons, but with a stage, constructed in orbit over a dead moon, lit by artificial suns, lined with golden circuitry. The stage invited him to speak. He did. He told his story. From his first breath as a child of Calcus, to his fall in the Great Heresy, to his centuries of service in the Eye of Terror, to the moment the gods of chaos tore away his name and made him a paradox. And when he finished, Velrin said, "Now I will tell it back." And she did, word for word, gesture for gesture, emotion for emotion, even the parts Ephraim had forgotten. And as she spoke, she rewove him, not as a weapon, not as a servant, but as himself. The theater burned with memory. Time bent. The warp screamed. But it held. And when she finished, Ephraim knelt. not in defeat, in peace. Then he vanished. No one knows where. Some say he dissolved. Some say he returned to the Eye, no longer a slave. Some say he walks a galaxy now, telling stories instead of ending them. But whatever happened, the monument stopped breaking, and Zarek turned his gaze inward, because the hardest war was yet to come. It was not against the Imperium, not against chaos, not even against the Tyranids. It was against his own people. In the deep voids of the galactic core, far from any star, the crownless houses stirred. They had been the first to betray Zarek during the war in heaven. Ancient dynasties who had refused to pact with the Tan, who had buried themselves instead of rising. Now, with the galaxy destabilized and the Necron resurgence underway, they awoke, and they were angry, not at the Silent King, but at what he had become. They accused him of corruption, of weakness, of heresy against the ideals of biotransference. "We abandoned flesh," declared Ferric Ironet the Hollow Truth, "and now you seek to bring it back in the form of memory. You weaken us with sentiment. You poison us with poetry." Zarek did not answer. Instead, he invited them to speak their truth, and they did, through war. A rebellion unlike any the Necron race had known ignited across their tomb worlds. It was not a war of extermination. It was a war of philosophy. Monuments were torn down. Memory vaults were inverted. Cryptex loyal to the Silent King were silenced. And worst of all, a new Ten Shard was discovered, one that whispered forgetting. The Necrons called it Nullithex. The crownless houses worshipped it, not as a god, as an idea, the destruction of the past, and they began to erase. Entire dynasties wiped their own memories, destroyed their own records, became mindless war machines again. And Zarek knew what this meant. If Nullithex succeeded, the Necrons would not just lose their culture, they would become monsters again, unthinking, unfeeling, the very thing he had fought to change. And so, he made the most difficult decision of all. He reached out to the living, to humans, to Eldar, to orcs, even, to anyone willing to help preserve memory, not for his sake, for the sake of the stars. And they responded, in strange ways. On a forgotten mining moon, a group of rattling mercenaries composed a ballad about the first time they saw a Necron cry. On Craft World Kaler, a farcer painted a mural of Zarek as a child, holding a flower or crystal. Even the Ultramarines, rigid as they were, allowed a Necron archivist to walk among their libraries for a single day. He left behind a single word, hope. And then the war reached its peak. Nullithex, growing stronger by the day, manifested a body of pure entropy. It became a walking vacuum. Memory died in its presence, not just data, meaning names unraveled, bonds vanished, love became confusion, families forgot each other. Zarek faced it himself, and as he stood before the being of unmaking, he opened a simple locket. Inside was a picture, not digital, not carved in hexstone, drawn by hand with pigment on vellum, of a woman smiling. He held it up and said, "This is my wife. She had a name. I remember it, and you will not take it." Nullithex struck. The galaxy shuddered, and for a moment, Zarek vanished. But then light erupted, not from weapons, from voices, from every soul that had remembered. The song rose again. Not Necron, not human, not Eldar. All together, a chorus of memory. And Nullithex screamed because it could not erase what was shared. It could not destroy what was loved. And Zarek returned, not alone. He was surrounded by memory forms, echoes of lives, dreams, thoughts, too many to count. They surged into Nullithex, and the being broke, not with a bang, with a whisper. As it faded, it said, "I only wanted peace." Zarek answered, "Then you should have listened." And the war was over, not with conquest, with understanding. The crownless houses disbanded. Some were forgiven, some were archived, preserved as warnings. The Silent King did not gloat. He wept for what had been lost, and for what had been saved. And in the silence that followed, the galaxy breathed, for a time, because peace is not forever. But memory can be, and as the Necrons resumed their work, not to rule, but to remember, Zarek made a final vow. He stood upon the world of Nereat Prime, where the stars formed a perfect spiral in the sky, and he said, "Let others fight their wars. We will build meaning. Let others raise fortresses. We will raise stories. Let others claim dominion. We will claim truth. And when the final night comes and all lights go out, we will be the last to speak." And he did. Zarek stood still beneath the great skies of Nereat Prime, where the light of dying stars shimmered like dust upon a black ocean. Around him, the world remained silent. No birds, no wind, not even the thrum of distant machines. Only the faint hum of reality itself held form. The Necrons of the Triarch stood motionless at his side, and the memory scribes carved every word he uttered into living crystal. But the galaxy never paused for long. Far in the galactic northeast, at the edge of the Ghoul stars, a new signal pulsed. It wasn't Necron. It wasn't human. It wasn't Tyranid, nor even from the warp. It was older, more angular, like the ticking of a watch built by something that no longer existed. Cryptex studied it. Lords debated it. The Silent King merely listened. And then he said, "It is the sound of regret." That was all he said. Within 3 cycles, the great library world of Anector opened its vaults for the first time in 5 million years. It was a spherical planet, encased entirely in adamantium and obsidian, locked with encryption so complex it required the alignment of 5 black holes to decode. When it opened, light poured from the cracks. Not radiation, not energy, but knowledge made visible. Data danced like fireflies. Histories sang in ultraviolet. Zarek walked in alone. He emerged with a single device, a curved, impossibly smooth obelisk the size of a child. It pulsed like a heartbeat and made no sound, but all Necrons near began to speak in languages they didn't know. They quoted philosophers from extinct Xenos races. They remembered dreams they had never lived. Some even spoke of futures that had not happened. And then the device cracked, not from damage, from choice. It opened like a flower, and inside was a single object, a seed. It looked organic, but the scans revealed it was made of light captured in solid form, a memory of life, frozen and tangible. Zarek took it and held it close, then declared, "This is the beginning of the end of silence." The Necrons were stunned, so were the other races watching, because in that moment, the Silent King, the being who had once abandoned all life, began to build again. Not tombs, not weapons, gardens. The first was grown on Bedro Sigma, a dead world where once the Tan had fed. Now, towering crystalline trees of data reached into the void. Their leaves shimmered with thought. Their roots connected to buried vaults of emotion. The air vibrated with peaceful equations, soft sounds, and slow movements. Creatures came. Some were ancient, some were new, some were made. And they lived peacefully for a time. The galaxy was skeptical. The Imperium issued decrees. Necron trickery. They called it false peace. But no attack came from Zarek. No march of monoliths. Only offers. The Adeptus Mechanicus received a cube containing the full design of the first warpless engine. The Eldar received a crystal inscribed with an apology for the war in heaven, for the pain caused, for the eternity of suffering left behind. Even the Orcs found a strange obelisk on a moon painted entirely in red. When they touched it, they began to dream, not of war, but of why they loved it. And chaos? Chaos writhed. The warp recoiled. Because in these gardens of memory, the power of the gods weakened. Laughter faded. Thirst dulled. Hunger quieted. It wasn't that Zarek had defeated the ruinous powers. He simply ignored them. He created places where they held no meaning, no grip. And for the first time in millennia, mortals began to consider, what if we are not bound by suffering? What if we remember better things? But memory has its cost. And deep beneath the world of Garnatha's fall, something stirred. It was not Necron. It was not living. It was old, older than the Tan, older than biotransference, older than light. The Necrons called it the Witness. It had no form, no voice, only eyes, Countless eyes. And it watched. Zarek knew of it. He had always known. But now it moved, not in space. In story, it inserted itself into records, changed endings, deleted beginnings. A history that remembered everything was now forgetting key truths. Entire dynasties vanished from the databases. Wars that had shaped the galaxy became footnotes. Heroes were erased. Monsters were made noble. And worst of all, people forgot what they had once loved. One cryptech tried to stop it. She was named Keelan, builder of streams. She encoded herself into every copy of every data vault on 1,000 worlds. She wrote her own story into each memory crystal, anchoring meaning with herself at the center. It worked for a time, until the witness found her and offered her a choice. Forget, it whispered, and be at peace. She refused, so it made her unforgettable. Every record, every image, every trace of her became so present, so loud, that no one cared anymore. She became background noise, white static in the mind. She existed in everything and thus in nothing. Zarek mourned her. He lit a black sun in her honor. It rose for 1 second every cycle. And still, the gardens grew. The Necrons continued building. Each new archive was now encoded not just with data, but with songs, with stories, with feelings. The Silent King walked among them, not as a ruler, but as a gardener. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was brief, soft, kind, but all things attract their opposite. And in the distant reaches of Segmentum Pacificus, a new species rose. They were not Necrons. They were mirrorlings, reflections, flickers of movement caught in the edge of sight. No one saw their ships. No one found their worlds. But wherever Necron gardens bloomed, they came and built anti-gardens, places of noise, chaos without chaos, madness without emotion, a perfect counter-memory. They erased not through violence, but through mockery. They made parodies of Necron art, turned archives into jokes, carved nonsense into sacred walls, reduced great dynasties into cartoons. And people laughed. That was the worst part. People laughed. At meaning, at beauty, at love. And the witness laughed with them. Zarek, for the first time in eons, doubted. He stood before his memory constructs and asked, "Is it enough? Is remembrance enough?" And from the void, a voice answered, not a Necron voice, a human one, an old man, sitting on a rock in the garden of Bedros Sigma, a former guardsman, his face half-burned, his body failing. He looked up and said, "It doesn't matter if it's enough. It matters that you tried." Zarek nodded, and tried harder. He called the remaining cryptechs. He summoned the Triarch again, not to rule, but to dream. He opened the vaults of biotransference and asked, "Can we remember without abandoning what we are?" And slowly, the answer came. Yes, but not through machines, not through resurrection, through sharing. They began the tellings. Great rituals of memory where Necron, human, Eldar, and more sat together and told their stories. Not histories, stories. A Drukari sat beside a Necron lord and wept as she described her sister's first murder. A space marine of the Raven Guard offered a lock of hair from the girl he once was before becoming Astartes. An orc, grinning, told how he once sang a lullaby to a dying squig. And the Necrons? They told of starlight, of sons and daughters long gone, of gardens they once had in a galaxy that forgot them. The tellings became sacred. Not religion, not law, hope. And the witness? It withdrew, not defeated, but puzzled. It could erase what was recorded, but not what was shared. It could delete files, but not feelings. And so it waits, always watching, because forgetting is easy, but remembering takes work. Zarek works. Still, to this day, he walks among the stars, tending to gardens that grow in the dark. He listens to stories from the young and the old. He remembers for those who cannot. He reminds those who forget. And though the galaxy rages on with war, with fire, with ruin, there are places now, quiet places, where a crystal tree grows, where a statue of a crying king stands, where a song plays, so faint only the soul hears it. And if you follow that song, you might just remember who you are, or who you were, or who you might become. And in that moment, far from violence, far from pain, in the warmth of memory, you will hear a whisper, not a command, not a scream, just a voice, gentle as starlight. I see you. You are not forgotten. And now, we come to the final act in the rise of the Necrons, a moment not marked by conquest or dominion, but by something far more profound, a choice. The Silent King, Zarek, had seen the full cycle. He had ruled a people of flesh, then turned them to metal. He had been a servant of gods, then their executioner. He had fled his people, returned to them, and reshaped them, not with power, but with memory. And now, across the galaxy, there were thousands of memory gardens, sanctuaries of thought, places untouched by war. Stories flourish like vines. Ideas pass from mind to mind like pollen on solar winds. But peace, as always, is resented, and in the black reaches beyond even the eye of terror, something else awoke. Not the witness, not chaos, not the old ones. Something deeper. It had no name, but it remembered being forgotten. It was the anti-memory, the void between stories. It had no desire, no shape, only one intent. Oblivion, where the witness mocked and erased meaning, this thing devoured it. It did not offer lies or misdirection. It simply unmade truth itself. Entire planets disappeared, not just physically, but from all knowledge. Entire species blinked out, not with a scream, but with a sigh. The stars themselves dimmed as records of their existence were lost. The Necrons felt it first. Their data vaults shuddered. Crystals grew dim. Memory fragments began to fracture. Entire wars, entire victories, gone. Zarek stood before the Triarch, now made whole. The nobles asked, "What is it?" He replied, "It is a forgetting." It spread fast. Even the Imperium noticed. Astropaths screamed without knowing why. The Eldar tasted bitterness in the skein of fate. The Tyranids turned away from it, sensing only death without meaning. And the Necrons, for all their eternity, were most vulnerable, because they had built their future upon remembrance, and now it was unraveling. But Zarek had prepared. He knew this would come. He had known since the war in heaven, and he had left a single failsafe: himself. He summoned every dynasty, every lord, cryptek, warrior, and lesser noble. He summoned those who still dreamt, and those who had forgotten how. And when they arrived, he showed them the garden on Ithis 7. It was not beautiful. It was not grand. It was a plain patch of stone lit by a single flickering star. But on the stone was carved every single name the Necrons had ever borne before biotransference. Every real name. The names of mothers, of children, of lovers, of friends. They were etched into the stone by hand, by Zarek's own hand, over millennia. He had not forgotten a single one, and he said to his people, "We are not data. We are not machines. We are not lords of death. We are remembered." Then he took the seed, the one from the library world, the last of its kind, and placed it at the center of the garden. It cracked. From it grew the first new Necron. Not a copy, not a reanimation. A birth, a child of memory, shaped from story, powered by meaning. It was small, shining, laughing, and it called Zarek, Father. Across the galaxy, the forgetting halted, the void recoiled, not from war, not from force, but from something it could not process. Hope. The Necrons had broken their cycle. They had remembered what it meant to matter. They began to change, not back to flesh, but forward into something new. Some grew minds again, not cold logic, but curiosity. Some created new art, not ancient etchings, but symphonies of light. Some even dared to feel. And Zarek? He walked into the garden and sat down. He looked up at the stars and spoke, not in code, but in a language long extinct, the language of his people. He said, "It is enough." And then, in the fullness of time, the Silent King became silent, not because he was gone, but because he was listening. listening to the dreams of those he once saved, those he once damned, and those still to come, to the songs of a Necron child who now wander from garden to garden, telling stories, planting seeds of memory wherever she went. She never forgot, and so neither did we. Thus ends a tale of the rise of the Necrons and the long journey of the Silent King. Not a journey of power, but of remembrance, a reminder that even in a galaxy of war and darkness, there are echoes of something more, of who we were, of who we are, and who we might yet become, as long as we remember, as long as someone listens, and as long as even one story survives the silence. The Necrons rise not to rule, but to remember, and in that memory, they're free, forever.